Okay, so here we are. Welcome to Wave 3. You'll remember we finished Wave 2, which was the Warring States period, 100 schools of thought, going into the Qin Dynasty, which established the wonderful bureaucracy and centralized government with the commanderies and the administrators, the officials answering to Qin Shi Huangdi in the capital. No more of this Zhou feudalism stuff that was such a nightmare. But instead, an ideological nightmare, you'll recall, because of the legalism that was so harsh on the people, so contrary to the Confucian values of the Western Zhou, of King Wen, King Wu, and the Duke, and all that. So the very impressive, unifying, standardizing, bureaucratizing Qin Dynasty only lasted for 15 years and was replaced with the Han Dynasty in 206 BCE, or 200 if you want to just round it off. For the next 400 years we saw Wu Di establish the Confucian scholar officials as the top of the social pyramid, creating a government that is run by not law enforcers but virtue examples. The only way to become honored and to become elite in China from the Han on, the highest honor is to be a man of letters, a scholar, and a public-spirited man, not a selfish man. Selfish merchants looking only for money for themselves were at the bottom of the pyramid, lower even than the artisans, who were lower than the peasants. After all, peasants is just a bad word for farmers, and farmers feed us. The Chinese never forgot that. So, but we saw the dynastic cycle kick in at the end of the Han Dynasty. Eunuchs taking over, a lame emperor, and that emperor's government being so bad that the rich-poor gap was huge. The peasants were not taken care of. The mandate of heaven was lost, and the general suffering of the population, as we talked about, compared to the Roman Empire, when the same situation's going on. The government stops taking care of its lowest classes, illiterate and poor, and those illiterate, poor, suffering people turn to salvation religions. They will believe anything. So just as the Roman Empire lost its power to a salvation movement of the early Christian cult 300 years after Jesus died, so did the Han Dynasty face a salvation cult, the Yellow Turbans. We have a book written by God. I work miracles. I faith heal. Confess your sins and you will be forgiven and go to heaven. Christianity turned Chinese, in a nutshell, turned Taoist. And but unlike the Roman Empire, the Han Dynasty did not cave in to the lower class religious cult. Instead, it sent out its army, its imperial army. 3 generals go out. 3 generals defeat the Taoists, and those generals then declare the end of the Han Dynasty and declare themselves new emperors, new holders of the mandate. So this begins the period of disunity from 220 to 580. Now look at that. This is so interesting just in terms of comparing it to Roman history, or European history, because you see that China, that's almost 400 years after the Han Dynasty, China is divided. It's fractured. It's astonishing that it will ever put itself back together again. 400 years is a long time for there to be no central, big, massive state. But for a number of reasons, China does manage to do that. So this is as close as we get, this period of disunity, to anything like Europe's medieval age. But this is not a dark age as in Europe, because they did not go to the religious salvation route. In Europe, you've only got monks and religious types, priest types, in monasteries who can read and write, and so their only focus is religious in their literature, because China did not go with its own salvation priest class, these Yellow Turbans. Instead, they're literate, scholarly, sophisticated, educated, artistic, secular, rational, literati continued to create during this age of disunity. So it's not a dark age. In fact, quite the opposite. It is what we like to call, or what I call, and notice I put TM trademark here because this is my language, this is my metaphor. I've looked at this 3,000, 4,000 years of history, and I like to identify patterns. It's one of the pleasures of knowing Chinese history so well, is that you see these beautiful things happen at these low points. Just one of the gorgeous sides of Chinese history. So here we go. We've got what would be called a dark age or a medieval period in Europe. Here we've got an artistic flourishing. During the Warring States period, it was the Confucians, the Taoists, and the Legalists, the 100 schools of thought, very philosophical. Here it's basically celebrities, rock stars, painters, artists. So TM means trademark here. I'm playing with you. Confucians without a cause. China has always been lucky to have more than one religion or philosophy. Monday through Friday, I'll be a responsible Confucian, a family man, a workman, all that sort of thing. But on Saturday and Sunday, I'll go fishing. I'll go up into the mountains. I'll hang out with nature. I'll drink wine. I'll paint calligraphy. I'll write poems. I will drink with my friends. And I'll just hang out in nature. So because the period of disunity was a corrupt one, these literati did not want to work for corrupt, non-mandate holding warlord types. So thus no compromise with a corrupt society. They go Taoist. So who is they? Well, we have the 7 sages of the bamboo grove. Rock stars, if you will. And I mean that as literally as I can. It's fascinating. Shi Kang, he played the guqin. Not only did he play it and was he known for it, this 6'8" giant of a wine-drinking, guitar-playing master, the Jimi Hendrix of China's medieval age, not only did he play this guqin in such a way that amazed everybody who heard him, but he also wrote poem essays about it. He wrote a rhapsody on the guqin, a rhapsody on the lute, which is a beautiful piece of reading. My audience here is not just my high school students, it's also any adults who actually like literature. I'm telling you, Shi Kang, read his rhapsody on the lute or the guqin. 7 or 8 pages, he goes into where the wood of his instrument came from. The pictures it on the peaks of Chinese mountains, particular type of wood, and what that location on a mountain peak does to the spirit and the power of his axe, of his guitar, his guqin. He talks about the difference between people who can hear and melt into music and really see the beauty of it and feel it, and those who cannot, who he pities. He's beautifully condescending towards people who don't understand art. This man is very, very civilized. He's beautiful. Wenji. By the way, Shi Kang was also these 7 sages of the bamboo grove. They're usually pictured. Picture this as artistic Chinese rock star posters. They're pictured sitting under trees, willow trees, bamboo trees in a forest, drinking wine, playing music, talking, joking, and they're always writing about being drunk. Wine in Chinese culture, there's no Jesus religion, there's no anti-body, anti-nature, anything, so there's nothing wrong with wine. Wine is the friend of artists, wine is the friend even of Confucians. Of course, one does not want to be tasteless or ugly in their drinking. In any case, so Wenji, because he is being courted by a corrupt family who has a lot of political power and a lot of money, and they hear that he's intelligent and such, they want him to marry into their family. To prevent that from happening, Ruenji is said to have stayed drunk for 60 straight epic days in order to prove that he was unfit to marry into this Jin family. So that's the 7 sages. That's only 2 of them, but they're worth a look. You can find their work translated online. I'll put some links up at the end of this if anybody wants them. So that's the seven sages. That's the first part of our cultural flowering, our second lotus blossoming. Wang Xizhi, he's our second one. Now, this man invited some friends to the Orchid Pavilion. And with his friends, all of whom liked to drink wine and write poetry and paint calligraphy, they had a drinking game. And in that drinking game of wine, friendship, and poetry, they floated glasses of wine down a stream that ran through the Orchid Pavilion, which is just about an hour south of Shanghai today in the countryside. And in some sort of game they played, they had to compose poems spontaneously as they continued to drink and progressively got more and more under the influence of this wine and friendship on this beautiful natural setting outdoors at the Orchid Pavilion. And at the end of that day, Wang Xizhi wrote a preface. By the end of that day, he wrote a little essay about being there with his friends and the sights and the feelings and all of that. And it's the preface to a collection that we can read today called The Poems of the Orchid Pavilion. Wang Xizhi's calligraphy, his writing of this preface, is one of, if not the most prized works of art in Chinese history, and it happened during China's medieval period. Again, compare this medieval period to Europe's. This guy is not saying life is horrible, there's no hope but to die and live in a heavenly afterlife. This man, with his love of language, friendship, wine, and nature, and poetry, heaven is here for him. And his calligraphy is stunningly beautiful. I will put some on a later version of this. This is a rough draft. So we see in this Middle Ages, this period of disunity, the birth of calligraphy as a high art. In his preface, it's very natural. He celebrates the views of misty mountaintops and down below of streams, of flowers, of nature and views, and his tone gets ecstatic. I so urge you to read a good translation of the Orchid Pavilion. But then, and this is something that we see over and over in these medieval poets, over and over we see them going from ecstasy, life is so beautiful, to something very bittersweet, a bittersweet turn. Because yes, life is beautiful. They celebrate it as they drink, but then they realize that, you know what, we are going to die, and that's very sad. And in the Orchid Pavilion, Wang Xizhi does this beautiful turn at the end, and he cannot say, in fact he disagrees with Zhuangzi, that life and death are, there's no difference, you shouldn't be afraid of them. And he says it's very sad that we're going to die, because life is so beautiful. But it's just accepted, and it never goes beyond that. It is just accepted, and in a way that makes life even more beautiful, because it adds this sadness to this otherwise ecstatic culture. So in any case, calligraphy will remain a Chinese art from this time. We have one more lovely poet in the period of disunity, Tao Qian. Tao Qian is another Confucian without a cause. He did work for these corrupt leaders, and he did not like working for them. He spent 13 years of his life working for the government, a corrupt government. And he retired early. And Tao Qian retired early, and you will see his return home. He said, I don't want to work in the system anymore. Counterculture, hippie stuff almost. And he returns to his cottage in the countryside, where he farms, plays his guqin, reads his books, writes, drinks wine, and is pretty much a hermit. So the return home is a subject of painting that you'll see in Chinese history. Him on a boat coming home. You'll see him often with a garland of flowers in his hair. Truly a hippie from the 4th or 3rd century CE. He wrote a wonderful little essay called Mr. Five Willows about a little man who lives alone in a house, a little hut with holes in the wall, and his clothes are dirty and they have holes in them, and he doesn't have any money and he can't afford wine, but his friends in the neighborhood know that in the village, so they invite him over to eat and have wine, and he always drinks as much wine as he can, and in fact too much, and he ends up just passing out wherever he happens to pass out. And he wakes up and he goes home and he just reads and reads his books because he loves to read, and he doesn't always get exactly everything in the books, but when he does, he really likes it. And he closes with, just with that. His name is Mr. Five Willows. So that's Tao Qian. So we have the 7 sages of the bamboo grove. We have Tao Qian, another guy who dropped out of the system. And we have Wang Xizhi and the calligraphy. That's the second lotus blossoming. Our confusions without a cause. Now, meanwhile, we'll just say that while this is going on politically, things are horrible, right? The 3 kingdoms is going on. These 3 generals fight each other. This is turned into the story of China's Iliad. It's also a movie called Red Cliffs. I guess I didn't put it on there. So the 3 Kingdoms is China's Iliad. I have read the first half of it. It's a good 1,000 pages in translation. Get Moss Roberts' translation from University of Berkeley. If you do the unabridged, get both volumes at once. It's brilliant. It's great fun. So that's the 3 Kingdoms. A historical novel, it's called. And then, things are horrible after this period of disunity, but then along comes one of those kingdoms and they unify all of China, just like Qin Shi Huangdi. So here we are. It's only maybe 50 years into after the Han, and they unify, but they do everything wrong. They make mistakes. Their mistakes, as we've talked about in class, they establish vassal states, fiefs, to their allies in this war, and that they also give jobs in the bureaucracy to people based on their family, not on their merit. So they just make all the mistakes of the Zhou dynasty politically, and very, very quickly that turns into a civil war between the princes, actual family members, and we're talking like within 50 years. So there's a power vacuum. These princes are all fighting each other, trying to unify things. And in that power vacuum, for the first time in Chinese history, something very odd happens. Nomads invade from the north, barbarians, and they conquer it. They take the entire Yellow River. They take the home of the original Zhou and Qin and Han dynasties. From the Wei River to all the way to Shandong and the Yellow Sea, it is under the control of barbarians. The Han have to flee south. China has been based on its northern river for so far the entire 1,200, 1,300 years since the Xia dynasty. And now, what am I talking about? 2,000 years since the Xia dynasty. And now, for the first time, they have to flee the Yellow River. In the south, they are refugees, and they settle on the Yangtze. And because they are basically pioneers in the Yangtze, which is a very backwards area at this point, full of swamps and disease and all sorts of things, they again sort of devolve to this need for a military aristocracy because they're fragmented. They're just a bunch of different kingdoms, sort of a government in exile, hoping things will get better in the north. In the north, something much more interesting goes on. The barbarians fight each other for a while until this tribe, the Xianbei, a barbarian tribe, actually does unify and defeat all of the other barbarians who have been marauding the north for a good 100 years or so. So in the 400s, the mid-400s, the Xianbei declares the Northern Wei Dynasty, WEI, and a very interesting thing happens. They start becoming Chinese. They hire Confucian officials. They translate they learn to read Chinese, but they also translate the Confucian classics into their language. They take Chinese names. They marry Chinese women. They wear Chinese clothes. They become totally Chinese. They settle down. They change into city people. They build a beautiful capital city after it had been burned down at the end of the Han during this barbarian invasion, or at the end of the Jin, actually. So they're doing beautiful things. But after about 100 years, at which point they had given up their barbarian names and taken Chinese names. So at this point, the Xianbei are indistinguishable. They speak Chinese, they have Chinese names, they dress Chinese, they know Chinese literature, they have Chinese government, everything. They have stopped being Xianbei barbarians. They are now calling themselves Han Chinese. That is called Sinicizing. S-I-N, Sin is the Latin word for China. So they have become Chinese. This is a pattern that we will see over and over. China is conquered, but it ends up absorbing whoever conquers it. They think they're taking over, but instead they're being taken under. They're being taken in by the culture. So it seems like things are on the upswing for China because they have a very civilized barbarian regime up north, but the frontier cousins of the cityfied Xianbei don't like this city lifestyle, and so out of jealousy and sort of cultural conflict and all sorts of things, they end up invading their own kinsmen in the capital, slaughtering them, and burning the capital down. So things go bad again. Eventually, though, out of all that, one of the Xianbei, former Xianbei, in that Northern Wei, does unify China and declares the Sui Dynasty. This is in 589. Whoops. So we have seen that China has gone from 220 to 589. In 589 CE, almost 600, the Sui unified China.